This podcast episode is sponsored by Geekdom, San Antonio's entrepreneurship hotspot and co-working space. Whether you need one-time recurring office space or event space, Geekdom has it all. Use code SOCIALBUTTERFLY when signing up for a membership to receive $25 off of monthly memberships. Welcome back to Unapologetically Visible, the podcast for high-achieving Latina and women of color founders who are done being the best kept secret. I'm your host, Christina Olivarez, award-winning leadership and visibility coach, TEDx speaker, and founder and CEO of the Social Butterfly Gal and Hustle and Socialize. We did it! Today is the 1-year anniversary episode of Unapologetically Visible, and I want to give a round of applause to you for tuning in every single week, or maybe you stumbled upon these episodes on social media and Google or your Claude or your ChatGPT. But I just want to take a moment of gratitude for you who tune in almost every week to these episodes. I want to thank you so much for all of your messages and your love and your ability to just feel like every single episode is speaking to you. And I'm just so grateful to have an audience that really cares for this podcast, that really cares to tune in almost every single week. And I'm just really filled with gratitude. If you've been listening for the past couple of weeks, I have been celebrating the 1-year anniversary of this podcast in the last 2 episodes. And what I like to call a 3-part series on all things podcasting. If you're somebody who wants to eventually launch a podcast, or you have a podcast and you're trying to figure out how to continue to grow it, these episodes in this series is just for that. I wanted to break down my process into how I made the decision to launch the podcast, what surprised me the most about this podcast, and today to kind of bring it back home and to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of this podcast. We are diving into all things lessons. It is really difficult at times to make a decision if you're wanting to launch a podcast, if you're wanting to start a podcast. And I think there have been so many things that have surprised me the most about this podcast in particular, but I really do believe that there have been so many lessons that I have learned throughout the 1 year that I've been doing this podcast. And I want to really dive into some of those lessons because I feel like the lessons that I've learned have really allowed for me to get a better understanding of who I am as a person and also as a CEO, and just my ability to try something new. And I know many of you are either in that in-between where you want to take a leap and do something new, but you're a little bit afraid of what's going to happen when you take that leap. And so I want to use this episode to, one, just give you that permission to go ahead and take the leap. The net will appear, but also just to celebrate the podcast and the determination it takes to launch something and see it through for a whole year. I feel like that's one of the things that I'm most proud of when it comes to this podcast is I did not give up, even when it was really difficult. Even if I felt like these episodes didn't matter, I wanted to see what it would be like to consistently move through the process of recording every single week. And I'm so grateful that I did. So in this episode, I'm going to go beyond the microphone, beyond the episodes, beyond the podcast marketing, and share some lessons that I've learned about what it really takes to build a body of work that people can trust. So I'm going to break down the top 3 lessons that I've learned in the 1 year of podcasting. So number 1, the biggest lesson that I learned is consistency is going to be super important when it comes to showing up regularly and showing up in your own way of fashion. I feel like the word consistency gets used a lot when it comes to social media, when it comes to showing up and being visible. But I really believed that consistency has allowed me to see myself in a very different way because of the fact that when I launched this podcast, I was going through a very difficult year. And if you listen to the couple of episodes where I talked about my process and when I made the decision to launch it, I was hesitant about launching this podcast. And that meant that I had to make a commitment to show up consistently and also to give myself grace when I wasn't going to be able to show up consistently. I launched this podcast at a time in my life where I was questioning so many things. My business was shifting and changing, and so was my personal life. I was going through a severe burnout when I decided to launch this podcast a year ago. I had just finished the seventh annual Hustle and Socialize conference, and I knew that I needed to take a pause, and I knew that I was not in a position at all to continue the conference, and it needed to just kind of be still for a moment and go back to my basics of why I launched my business Social Butterfly Gal in the first place and why I do the work that I do in my coaching and in my speaking. And so I launched this podcast at a really inconsistent time of my life. And that's why I knew that being consistent was going to be the key to get through this process of launching a podcast. And there were so many reasons that I felt I could have disappeared. And I think the most surprising time period was I knew I was going to have surgery, and I knew that the physical limitations that I was going to have was going to prevent me from recording or prevent me from coming to the space to actually record. And that really helped me see consistency in a very different way because I knew that even though I was going to be physically unable to record, I knew that I could batch record and that I could take ownership of how I record these episodes and still maintain that consistency, even if I was physically unable to show up in the way that I needed to go. There was a common goal that I had for this podcast in particular that helped me to remain consistent. And one of the common goals that I have was I just really wanted to have each and every single episode as a way for us to develop a very genuine connection, a very raw and honest relationship. I wanted it to feel like you and I were having a cup of coffee in your living room, on your couch. And that was sort of the reasoning of why I felt that consistency was going to be key, because every single goal of every episode, that's all I wanted. I wanted for you to feel seen, heard, and understood. And I think what was so beautiful about your messages was there were so many messages that I received about specific episodes where so many women like yourself felt seen, heard, and understood. And I think that's really important when we think about consistency. I feel so many people who launch podcasts, when they think of the word consistency, they automatically think like, well, I need to show up every single week, or I need to have this recording frequency, very similar to creating social media content. And my version of consistency is completely different. What I did care the most was, am I consistent enough for you to build that genuine relationship with me, for you to feel like you are being validated in your experiences as a business owner, as a wife, a mom, a future mom, somebody who's an empty nester, all of the roles that we play as women. I just really wanted to be consistent in that regard. And so some of the episodes that I've had were super highly strategic, very well versed in the work that I do as a coach. And then some episodes were very personal and deeply personal. And some of them came from client conversations or directly from things that I was trying to understand in real time. And that is what mattered. That consistency of how I show up, how I'm breaking things down to a point where you feel seen, heard, and understood. The lesson that I took from that is just, I really wanted to build the consistency so that I could show up in a way that social media didn't really allow for me to do. And it allowed for me to go beyond the limitations of a 60 to 90-second post. And so I have to say that in the consistency, there was also a very deeper visibility lesson here. And that is sustainable visibility is built through continuity and not just from consistent intensity. So not every episode needed to be this breakout hit just for the podcast to become an asset in the way that I use this podcast for my marketing and to build know, like, trust. The second lesson that I feel I learned throughout the 1 year of podcasting is the fact that the most powerful thought leadership came from my lived experience. Expert. Many of us want to build that expertise. And I feel like one of the things that has been happening in the process of building this podcast is the fact that I've been wrestling with this thought about my lived experience and what that means for how I show up, how my visibility is, what stories I tell, how I share specific information in more of a well-rounded leader versus just the thought leader of social media and marketing and business and strategy. I'm a human too. I'm a human first. And I feel like that's the biggest lesson that I learned on top of the consistency is that you are human first and your lived experience is going to be super important and very valuable to the context of your podcast. I made it a goal very early on that I wanted for each episode to have some structure in the way that I break down my process of building an episode. And one of that structures that I wanted, or that specific framework, was I really wanted to make sure that I was sharing bits and pieces of my own personal life and my own experience as a business owner, because it's really important for you to hear it directly from me, but also it's very important for you to know the human behind the business and behind the online persona. In fact, one of the top rated episodes in this podcast, it's still number one to this day in the whole entire year, is online perceptions versus real life. And I think that that's just so true about the biggest lesson that I've learned is it's really important to have more of the human side in this and to let down your guard and to not be afraid to share the things that you want to share and to provide your own point of view and your own perspective and your own opinion. And I feel like that was one thing that I really wanted to do with the podcast is I know that you are listening right now and you already know how to build a business. You've already have gone through that, but there was a lot of episodes in this podcast in the first year that dealt with me turning 35 and what that looks like from my nervous system capacity and my nervous system overload and my fibroid journey, my fertility journey, navigating financial hardships, self-trust, and outgrowing old versions of success that I really had to unlearn. And so those episodes really worked because not only were people receiving my expertise, but they were encountering the human side of who Christina is. And I feel like that's become one of the larger lessons of my own visibility evolution this year is that people don't always need another social butterfly gal, Christina masterclass. Sometimes they need to just hear how myself, Christina, actually thinks when the answer really isn't obvious and how I think when things are kind of going up and down. And so I feel like that's why this podcast is really uniquely suited to the direction that my brand is moving, even now 1 year later. The podcast just really allows for me to have a really good, meaty, juicy 20 to 30 minute of inside my head and inside my thinking. And so you're going to hear a lot of that nuance and my conviction, some uncertainty, my humor, my stories, the way I coach myself, the way I coach my clients, and the way I challenge assumptions and how I work through that. And I feel like that was sort of the biggest lesson that I had to learn is when I think about someone who is considering spending, over $12,000 to $24,000 working with me privately in one-on-one coaching, that level of proximity to the human side of Christina is absolutely important. And it's one of the reasons why I'm just so grateful that this podcast has taught me that, because I feel like I can let loose a little bit more and you really get to know who I am beyond the Instagram facade, if you will. Which then leads me directly into my third lesson. And the third lesson is this podcast isn't just another content channel. It's really about building that long-term trust and conversion asset. I feel like the goal of the first year was obviously, consistency, building that digital body of work and really bringing out the human side to that, which was also a goal of producing depth and really thinking about how someone is going to discover me. So we know that many of you might have discovered this podcast from Apple Podcast recommendations, Spotify recommendations, maybe on ChatGPT or Claude. Some of you are my Instagram followers or have been following my entrepreneurial career since the very beginning. And so wherever you kind of land on finding Unapologetically Visible, I knew that there was going to be, 50 plus opportunities to understand how I think and how I process. And so I feel like anytime someone is thinking about hiring a coach, that's sort of like the thing that they're thinking about is this coach going to challenge me or just tell me what I want to hear? And I feel like this podcast actually allows for me to reduce the perceived risk of all of the things that you could be thinking of that could be some objections or you're just hesitant on. And so I feel like the biggest lesson that I learned the most is this podcast really allows for that opportunity to build know, like, trust. And so when I was thinking about my podcast and when I was thinking about my strategy, I think so much of us, when we think about podcasting, we automatically think of like, okay, how many downloads am I going to have? What's the growth of the podcast? How am I going to be more visible? And I feel like I am now evaluating the podcast in a very different way. So the way that I think and understand the equation now in my podcast is it's kind of going like this, like discovery to listening to recognition to trust, conversion, and then becoming a client. And I think for me in particular, just the goal for the first year was I really wanted to have that humanness, that depth, that know, like, trust, and to show that there is a world out there where you can be a very highly visible, unapologetic leader. And that's the goal for this whole entire podcast. All it takes is for one person to make a difference. It takes one client, one person to kind of get that momentum going. And so even if I had one person listening or 10,000 people listening, that one person listening is just, going to make a huge, huge difference in the way that I think about podcasting and the way that I see it. And so again, I just feel like this podcast has taught me so much about the human side of content creation and my ability to share things and to build that relationship with you. I still cannot believe it has been 1 year. When I look back at Christina from a year ago and I see her now, I'm just so grateful that I kept the fun in this podcast. I never wanted it to feel like work and I never wanted it to become something that I could resent. And I really hope that I could continue this into year 2. But the fact that I stayed consistent with 53 episodes in my very first year of podcasting, even creating podcast episodes during my time where I was physically unable to record during the time that I was having surgery, and just my ability to keep showing up every day. It's just so beautiful. And I'm just so grateful that you listen to this podcast, that you really enjoy it. And I have a call to action for you. If you are listening, I would love for 2 things so number 1, in order to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of this podcast, I would love it if you could write a review on Apple Podcasts. If this podcast has touched you in any way, if it has caused you to have breakthroughs or shifts, if it has caused you to just feel a little bit better about who you are at your core, if you have ever felt inspired or moved or taken action because of one of the episodes, please go on Apple Podcasts, even go on Spotify. You can go to the star rating and rate this podcast and leave a comment. It is so important to have reviews from loyal listeners like yourself. Every single review helps this podcast become more visible to the people who need it the most. So if you could just do that to celebrate with me, leave a review. And then number 2, I would love to hear from you. As I go into the second year of this podcast, I want to make sure that I am providing really great, juicy episodes from you. I want to know some things that you might be interested in that you would want for me to discuss on this podcast, whether it is topics about business or leadership or being a Latina in business, growing your family, just all of the different things that a woman has to go through, a high achieving woman has to go through. You can always send me a DM on Instagram at the Social Butterfly Gal and just tell me what you are hoping to hear more of in the second year of Unapologetically Visible. All of your feedback and your reviews really help me so much. So again, if you could just do those 2 things, that would be so incredible. Again, as we celebrate the 1-year anniversary of Unapologetically Visible, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for listening, for messaging me, for your reviews, for listening to every single episode, for sharing the podcast with your friends. Please share more and more so we could get this podcast in the hands of those who need it the most. Thank you so much. And here's to year 2. If you resonated with this episode, here's what I want you to do next. Subscribe and leave a review because that helps this podcast reach more women like us, women who are never meant to stay hidden, women who are meant to be highly visible leaders. Share this episode with someone you love who is thinking about launching a podcast. And DM me on Instagram at the Social Butterfly Gal. Tell me your biggest reframe, your biggest breakthrough from today's conversation. And if you're feeling the call to go deeper, to recalibrate your personal brand, leadership, and your visibility, I would love to support you through one-on-one coaching. You can find the coaching information and offers in the links in the show notes below, or send me a DM with the word coaching, and I will personally walk you through what offers are in alignment with your current season and what it looks like to step into this next era with clarity, confidence, and unapologetic authority. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening and for all of the shares and reviews. Remember this, you didn't come this far to play safe. You came here to be unapologetically visible. I'll see you next week.